The Still Loading podcast is brought to you by the wonderful people on Patreon. Amazing people like Charles M., Stephen P., Mr. Biscuits, Gilmer, Kevin from the Bit by Bit Foundation, and Eric H. have been wonderful enough to support the show over on Patreon. So if you would also like to get your name read at the beginning of an episode along with a bunch of other bonus goodies, go over to patreon.com/stillloadingpod and see everything it has to offer. On this episode of Still Loading, a dream team through the ages. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new episode of the Still Loading podcast. I'm your host, Josh Koval, and today's episode is the finale of Toriyama Month. We have gone through Dragon Quests 1, 2, and 3, but now we are switching gears. We are not covering another Dragon Quest game. We are covering probably one of my favorite games of all time, and I know for certain it's one of my guests' favorite games of all time. We are, of course, today talking about the time travel RPG Chrono Trigger, and joining me to discuss this chronological extravaganza is my good friend of the show, Aidan Moher. Aidan, how are you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing great. Any chance to talk about Chrono Trigger is a good day, so I'm happy.
I'm happy to have you back on. The last time you were on was actually almost a year ago for the Final Fantasy Draft. So it's good to have you back on since then.
Thank you. I can't believe that was a year ago and I was robbed.
I was so surprised, not because Mick was the one who won it, not because his draft was bad, but I was surprised how wide the margin was. Now, technically, people can vote as many times as they want, so I don't know if anyone fudged the numbers. I can't tell. I didn't want to gather people's email addresses because I feel invasive doing that. So
absolutely. No, it was a ton of fun. Yeah.
It was a good time, man. So yeah, we're here to talk about Chrono Trigger, and I know you are a huge Chrono Trigger fan. You have written about it numerous times. In fact, I actually signed up for a Medium account just so I could read your history of Chrono Trigger that you wrote for, who was it, Cartridge? What was that?
It was Insert Cartridge, which is just the name of a blog that yes. I ran on Medium. It's sort of laying fallow these days, but there's a ton of good content there, like Timeless, which is the history of Chrono Trigger that you're referring to, which yes. I really enjoyed writing back a couple of years ago. I guess 2021 probably, something like that.
I think that makes sense.
I had just nailed down a deal for my book, which is Fight Magic Items. It's a history of Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and the rise of Japanese RPGs in the West. I had, the contracts for that were underway, and I was like, I need to figure out how to write, a compelling history by drawing on, sources via their perspectives at the time. I didn't want, I didn't want my thing to be, what do people think of Chrono Trigger now? Or what do people think of, Japanese RPGs in the 90s now? The perspective is, what did they think about when it was happening? And so I wrote Timeless. It's long, it's like 10,000 words, but it's one of my favorites. I feel like it holds up really well and still does justice for a game that I really love, that has a fascinating history and a fascinating legacy.
I really enjoyed. I didn't get to finish reading because it is a long read. It's like a 40-minute read or so, but yeah. it was an engaging read of what I was able to get to sneak in during work breaks. I mean, I didn't do that. You can't prove anything, but I was enjoying reading it quite a bit, and there's lots of great info in it. Some of it I could. It's funny, in doing my own research before, I wanted to do my own research and then read yours to kind of supplement it, and I noticed a lot of the same sources, like the Shmuppalations interviews and stuff like that. So it was kind of cool to see. I was like, all right, I'm doing a good job. I'm actually getting good research like Aidan's doing here, but. Oh, sorry, go ahead. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say, these old games are fascinating because, it was at a time when we do have a lot of like creator interviews that still exist and are accessible online. And it was a time when the industry, like even companies like Square and Enix, back then would, be a lot more open about developmental like processes, and you'd have access to the teams talking about things in a more organic way, rather than nowadays when it's very like PR driven. And you still get fantastic interviews with the Final Fantasy team when they're releasing games, but there's something about those old Smuplations interviews that just like feel like a peek, behind the curtain at the people, like the real people making the games, not filtered through that PR lens. And so you get these really personal, like interesting human stories about the games and the people who made them. And there's so much out there that a lot of what I like to do is try to, somebody could spend hours or days researching Chrono Trigger's history online from a dozen different sources, 24 different sources. But what I wanted to do is try to create one home that tells that narrative in a compelling way so that it brings everything together. It brings all those interviews together. It brings the firsthand, impressions and memories of those games together into one place.
And I definitely think you did a very good job at doing that, because it tracks the development really well. Like even like pre like when what is it, the trip to North America that Yuji Horii, Sakaguchi, and Toriyama all took in 92, I want to say, which is kind of like where 92 for graphics research trip is what it is written, and that's kind of where the seeds of Chrono Trigger were sown, and they kind of started wanting to work together. But you mentioned developer interviews, and I normally would have used this as a perfect segue into like the dream team that developed this game, and we're going to get into that. But before we get into the dream team, I just want to set that up for the listeners to give them a little bit of a teaser of what we're going to talk about in just a moment. We're going to talk about personal history, like how we both kind of discovered this game. I'm actually going to go first because I've heard bits of your story, and you got to experience this when it was a launch game. I did not get to, so I want to kind of like end the personal experiences with yours, because I think nostalgia is, I love hearing nostalgia, so I want to kind of leave my listeners with that as well. And my own personal history with it, when I was first getting into kind of older game, like getting into retro gaming as it were, I remember my friend Justin, former co-host of the show, he loved this game, and he would always tell me how it's like one of the best games of all time. And back when I was first getting into JRPGs, I was thinking a little bit too snobbish, where I'm like, oh, it's an older game, like why aren't you playing the new thing? And as you get older, your opinions change, and mine obviously did. And I remember watching him play it. The first time I actually played this game was on the PS1 port of it, and oh my god, because every random encounter it had to load, and it was so slow. It was awful. It was absolutely awful. And I didn't let that, thankfully that didn't completely ruin the game for me, because I think someone even told me, were like, that's not what it's like on the Super Nintendo. I'm like, oh thank god, because this is abysmal. I could not do it. And then I remember once I got into collecting, I would see Chrono Trigger is always one of the most valuable games. Like if you go to conventions, it was consistently, even back in like the early 2010s, it was still like $100 for the cart. And now it's even more expensive. You're looking at like over 200 or maybe even 300 now. I don't know off the top of my head, but it was even expensive back like a decade ago. I did eventually pick up a copy, I think for like $125, but it was still $125 American, excuse me. But it was still something that was like, it was considered almost like a grail to me for a little while. And when I finally got to play it, I was still living with my parents, and I remember sitting down and really being impressed with a lot of the game mechanics, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And I think more than anything, this game felt so forward thinking to me. And so I played this with no nostalgia. There's not any nostalgia for me in this episode in the sense of like playing it as a kid. I played it for the first time when I was in college, and I loved it. I loved it the first time I played it, though I did screw up and I didn't get a new game plus, because you can do that if you don't finish the game correctly, which we'll get into. But there is a new game plus in this game, which was also at the time, I didn't really know that existed all the way back then. Yeah,
it was uncommon.
Yeah, you never saw that back then. So that's my experience with it. My friend Justin sung its praises for decades, talked about how good the music was, talked about how cool the game was. And I was like, yeah, I'm sure it's cool and whatnot. And then I finally, once I got into retro gaming and I sought it out and played it, I wanted to play it on original hardware, finally played it and loved it. And then for this episode, I replayed it on my Nintendo DS, where I got some of the extra content as well as the anime cutscenes done by Toriyama. So it was cool. That was my personal experience, though. So Aidan, I want to throw it over to you. How did you first discover Chrono Trigger? Let's go back in time, as it were, and talk about how you first connected with this game.
Yeah, so like you said, I go all the way back to like launch with Chrono Trigger. Back in the 90s, like the early to mid 90s, I loved video games. I loved reading. Those were the two things I just couldn't get enough of. But when it came to video games, I mostly liked stuff like Ninja Turtles on the Game Boy and Super Mario Land and platformers and sort of action-y games, Tetris. Those sort of more reflex-oriented, like, instant gratification type games, which I still love. And one time I was at, like, speaking of like, like when you're young and stupid and I was at a friend's cousin's house and he had a Game Boy too. I was like, oh, that's sweet. Love Game Boys. I've got my Game Boy. I'm playing Ninja Turtles. And he was like, oh, I'm playing this game. You want to try it out? And it was Final Fantasy Legend 2, which was an RPG. And so that was my first like introduction to like RPGs, console RPGs specifically, and I did not like it at all. It was, slow, it was grid based, it was, you're wandering around a map, then the screen changes and there's just a big static tiger guy. And I wasn't impressed. I gave him his Game Boy back. I was like, I'll stick with Ninja Turtles. But then fast forward a few years later, I was, at that point really getting into reading a lot of epic fantasy, Lord of the Rings, Terry Brooks. That was my jam. And I also had just me, I grew up the eldest of three brothers, and my parents would often get babysitters whenever they needed it. And they got a cool babysitter who would bring video games over to our house. So he was probably 4 or 5 years older than us. We would usually play Doom. So we would do like LAN, like deathmatch and stuff in Doom. And then one night he brought over a game after my brothers had gone to bed. He brought over a game called Final Fantasy 3 and he popped it in my Super Nintendo. We started a new game together. And that was just like, that was it. It was over. We escaped through the mines in Narsh, and I talk in my book. I've talked on other, podcast episodes about how like the first time I watched Terra step onto that safe spot, in the Narsh mines, and it felt safe. It felt, like a moment to breathe. I was like, whoa, this is like reading. Yeah. Or this is like playing an epic fantasy novel. Right. And so I just couldn't get enough of it at that point. Loved Final Fantasy 3, Final Fantasy 6. And then I also got, like, at that point I was also getting a lot of video game magazines. And so at that, from that point on, I was just scouring for anything to do with Final Fantasy. And so it wasn't long after that I found out that the guy who made Final Fantasy was, the company that made Final Fantasy 6 was making another game called Chrono Trigger. And it just became my life at that point. Like, Chrono Trigger was it. I had to have it. It looked amazing. It was, going to change the world. And so I just poured over those magazines. I can still remember all the reviews, the previews, I know exactly which magazine am I, cause I have a ton of old magazines. I know exactly which ones are the Chrono Trigger issues. And so I just obsessed over it. And, eventually I think it came out in the fall, in September or October in North America. But in any case, I had to wait little ways, a couple of months until my birthday, which is near the end of the year. And I got it for my birthday. And I remember going to Toys R Us, driving home, sitting in the back of the car reading that big manual, like finally have it. And I just like sunk into it. You know, it was a weekend. It was also over Christmas break. So it was like, you know, 2 weeks of just like playing Chrono Trigger nonstop. Like by the time we were back at school, I had reached the kingdom of Zeal, and, you know, like it had changed my life. It had changed the world, because this was something that was like above and beyond anything I thought video games could do. You know, so I, you know, played through it. I beat it in a couple of weeks, and then you unlock New Game Plus, and I was like, oh, okay, this is it. I can play this game again. And
with
you know,
all this
Chrono Trigger,
that you had before.
yeah, and Chrono Trigger is fascinating to me because, and Chrono Cross is the same, because its New Game Plus changes the way the game feels. There are some like modern games. There are a lot of modern games like Elden Ring. You play New Game Plus, and it like everything gets harder, right? Like the enemies get harder. They're higher level, and it's supposed to create increased a renewed challenge for players who have reached the end. Chrono Trigger was the opposite. You just carry over all your stats, all your items into the exact same game. There's no level scaling or anything. And it almost becomes like an adventure game, a narrative adventure game, because combat becomes so trivial, especially for the first half, that your time and attention is focused on exploring the world, you know, going through the story, seeing how fast you can get through things. And it feels so different. And I remember, like, you know, I reached Zeal in 2 days this time. And I remember racing out of my bedroom and being like, mom, like you won't believe it. I got to Zeal in 2 days. It took me 2 weeks the first time. And so that was a point where I just like, you know, my interest when it came to video games shifted from action platformers and puzzlers to RPGs like all the time, and I just became obsessed with them. And you know, and that was around grade 7, and here in BC where I live, in British Columbia in Canada, we have just elementary and high school. So like grade 7, then I went on to grade 8, which was the start of high school. And you know, my close friends also loved RPGs, but also like other kids older than us loved RPGs in my school, and kids younger than us loved RPGs. So, you know, that golden age of like the end of the Super Nintendo into the PlayStation era that preceded and followed Chrono Trigger was really just this like really intense period in my life where like Japanese RPGs in particular, and Square Enix RPGs, were like the thing that brought so many of us together and created like bonds of friendship that are, you know, that still exist and are still around. I still text about, you know, PlayStation RPGs with the guys I was playing those games with back then. So, you know, you have this genre that everybody looks at as like a singular thing you play on your own. But for me, it was always more than that. It was always something that was like, you know, communal. And I, you know, like, I think that Chrono Trigger was the first kind of step forward in that for me to say, hey, Final Fantasy VI was cool, but it wasn't just a one-off. It's like, this is something that like is repeatable. It's something that can grow and evolve and become something richer. And I just took that forward, and it's never really let go since then. So yeah, Chrono Trigger was a big one for me back in the day. And, you know, I do have a lot of nostalgia for it. I've also written about it and, you know, researched it a lot. And so I also feel like I, you know, have a lot of just, you know, respect for what it is, how it came to be, and how unlikely its existence was, like how close it could have been to like any other reality where, like, you mentioned the Dream Team earlier, we'll get to them, but like when you get that much kind of ego and history and expertise in a room together, it can go two ways, right? And Chrono Trigger fortunately went the way it did, and it, you know, it's become what it's become. And I can kind of appreciate that aspect of it. It's place in games history a lot now too.
It's such a fantastic game. And I mean, I guess we're kind of not so much of a spoiler. We both have said we really like this game. And I did an episode a couple years ago. Shout out to Dave from Tales from the Backlog. I did an episode on Chrono Trigger with him. And one thing that I think we kind of came to it at the end of the episode, and I kind of want to get it off at the top here, or like start with it at the top. It's honestly a really nice entry level RPG for people. Like for like, and it's not to say that it's easy, because it's not. There's hard elements to it. I think the final battle with Lavos still gives me some trouble, because I'm not always the best at strategy and strategy and whatnot. But it really is initiating. It's a good initiation for people who want to get into JRPGs, old school JRPGs, and just to kind of see what they're like. Because not only is this game like really accessible in terms of a gameplay standpoint, it's also beautiful. Like the sprite work in this is still stunning all these years later. And I can't get over it. One thing when I was doing research, and I did not know about this, there's actually like portions of the game that use pre-rendered graphics, like in Donkey Kong Country. The opening cutscene with the pendulum swinging, the clock pendulum, that was pre-rendered CG. But they used it. They used it kind of the way like you're supposed to use CG in movies. Use it to accentuate, focus, like rely on practical effects and use CG to kind of like assist it, kind of like what Jurassic Park did. And it kind of feels like what they did with this game, some of the visual effects are done with pre-rendered graphics, but by and large, the game is hand-drawn sprites and hand-drawn art. And it's stunning all these years later. It's beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very inviting. It managed to like be evocative of, we're talking about Akira Toriyama this month. It managed to be evocative of his art and his style in a way that like had never really been represented in that era before, right? Like he had been doing artwork for Dragon Quest for a long time, but until Dragon Quest 6 and Chrono Trigger, you didn't really see his artwork articulated to a high level of like fidelity outside of battles, right? So in Dragon Quest, you can see Akira Toriyama's, touch and his style in battle, but you get out of battle and, for the most part, the small sprites are, they're just size-wise, they just lack detail to be able to express that very distinct Toriyama style. But Chrono Trigger and Dragon Quest 6, which came out, fairly contemporaneously, took that and really made a world that felt like an Akira Toriyama drawing. And that to me is one of the things that makes it still remarkable. It still feels like something that was, it was the best artists of the generation working at the peak of their skill, right? The next generation, we flipped on over to the PlayStation. It has some beautiful pixel art games, but it was also a generation where the creators were learning something new, right? Yeah. And they were learning how to make effective and beautiful 3D games. And when you look at, like early generation 3D versus late generation, like 16-bit pixel art, there's just no real comparison, right? Like it just... it's not until you get to the end of the PlayStation life cycle and you look at stuff like Chrono Cross or you look at Vagrant Story and you're like, okay, like now we're starting to get somewhere, but Chrono Trigger holds up. I mean, better than anything on the Nintendo 64, outside of maybe Paper Mario, Ogre Battle's pretty good.
I'm personally partial to Donkey Kong 64, but that's just
Donkey Kong. Yeah. It looks.
I am an apologist for that game. I will die on the hill. It's not as bad people say.
I like Donkey Kong 64. I like all the platformers, but they were blurry. They were low res. Like they were stretching. They were stretching the hardware.
Yeah. It just had a weird blur in general to it.
Yeah. I'm reading John Romero's memoir right now about making Doom and Quake and stuff. And he talks a lot about like the challenges of pushing technology forward, but still creating like artistically compelling, cutting edge game visuals, gameplay design. And you can see it there. You can see like Chrono Trigger is something where you had the creators in an environment where they're very comfortable. And so that also meant they knew how to create an experience. And I think this is what you're touching on, is it's very accessible, even for newcomers, because it's impeccably paced, right? They knew how at that point to, like cut out all the fat, and, like anything that wasn't, and it's not like, it's not trimmed down to nothing either, which is what's interesting. Like it's impeccably paced, but every moment is full of story, or it's full of character development, or it's full of the two kind of coming together, which is so rare. And then they filed off all the rough edges, right? Like they've just refined it down to something that's like, here are the best elements of 16-bit console RPGs in one package. And it does that without compromise in a way that just allows, the very best ideas to crystallize into something that couldn't be repeated again, because you needed, how long you needed 12 years, 15 years of RPG design to come together into, a finale, basically. Whereas now we see more iterative game design, right? Like, sort of builds on what's come before. Chrono Trigger felt like a series finale of like a generation of RPGs.
It really felt like the send-off of the 16-bit RPG, even though there was some games that came out in on Super Nintendo. There were RPGs that came out on Super Nintendo after this. Yeah, this game really feels like that culmination, and in large part due to what we've been referencing a lot, the Dream Team. The Dream Team of this game, and a bunch of incredible creators, and a lot of them on this team would go on, like you say in your article on Medium, or in the history that you wrote on Medium, they went on to do a lot of different things. I'm not going to list all of them, otherwise we'd be here for a little bit. But Hironobu Sakaguchi, the creator of Final Fantasy, Yuji Horii, the creator of Dragon Quest, Akira Toriyama, the creator of Dragon Ball, who did the art for the Dragon Quest games, Nobuo Uematsu, who was the composer for Final Fantasy. I like that you included Yasunori Mitsuda, just because even though at that time he wasn't an established figure in video games just yet, this was like his first big game. This was his first game, period, that he composed, right?
Yeah. He was like a sound designer on Final Fantasy V. And as the story goes, he went to Sakaguchi or Aoki maybe and said, you know what, I want to do a game or else I quit. And then the boss was like, okay, fine, you can have Chrono Trigger. And then this, like, he was like 20, 21, like he was very young, Mitsuda, at the time. They go, okay, you can have Chrono Trigger. And then he goes on to create one of the greatest game soundtracks of all time as like an inexperienced, like 21-year-old. Incredible. And that's like, as you're getting to, it's like, it's not just the big names. It's not just the like Horii and Sakaguchi and Toriyama. There's like, there's Masato Kato is in there. There's Naoki, no, not Hamaguchi, Katase was in there. Like, it's all these names of people that, like, in the intervening 30 years have gone on to become like primo names in Japanese RPGs. And I think it's something like 12 people who worked on Chrono Trigger went on to become directors of like major titles for Square Enix, which is just remarkable. Like, the assembly of talent on that team is just unbelievable.
Know what it reminds me of? You ever, like, do you watch the NFL at all?
I follow it from the side, but I don't watch a lot. Yeah.
So sometimes I don't watch it all that often either. I kind of follow it from the side. But one thing that they will bring up is they'll talk about like a coaching tree. Like, they'll look at one head coach who did something phenomenal. They'll look at all their assistant coaches, and then they'll see what their assistant coaches did. Like Andy Reid coached all these people who would go on to so-and-so, and who coached Andy Reid, that kind of stuff. Or who was the head coach while Andy Reid was still coming up, that kind of thing. And this game feels like that a little bit, Absolutely. Like, this was like the powerhouse that kind of created inadvertently, but it, created sent all these incredible people. Now, some of them were already established, like we mentioned with Sakaguchi and Horii. Obviously, Toriyama was gigantic even back in 95, because Dragon Ball Z was already out at that point, which I guess was technically just a continuation of Dragon Ball, the manga. But in any case,
I mean, Toriyama was big when Horii went after him for the first Dragon Quest.
Because Dr. Slump was already a big thing.
Yeah, he was already big. Yeah.
So it's just bonkers to me. And I think the thing that cannot be understated is the fact that Yuji Horii and Hironobu Sakaguchi collaborated, because you can't. That's the equivalent of like who would be a good, like, Shigeru Miyamoto and Miyazaki from FromSoft, right? Like, two giant powerhouses of their respective sides. Now, granted, that's not exactly the same, because Miyamoto doesn't make anything like Souls games. Like, it's not a perfect parallel. But in terms of,
it would be like AC/DC and like Metallica and Guns N' Roses doing a collab album, right? Like,
creating a supergroup. They create a supergroup for
and
one
then
album.
making something sweet, like not making something that's an absolute mess.
You just don't see that now, because, and for better or worse, arguably worse with how the games industry has been going lately, with how corporate everything is and how like team tribal focused it is, you're never going to see something like this. At least not anytime soon, unless the respective creators quit whichever companies they work for and decide to strike out on their own. But you're never going to see this collaboration now. Yes,
no, not at not in the AAA space, not in a game the equivalent of Chrono Trigger, right? Which would be a gigantic Square Enix RPG, right? Which would cost $200 million to make or whatever nowadays.
Yeah.
But where I do think, like you say, sometimes what you have are people leaving their studios and forming, something new where they can work independently. But I do think that we're seeing a little bit more of this in like the indie space in terms of like a coming together of small, like intensely talented teams that can really thrive at doing what they do best. You see all these like, single creator games. Like I'm playing Animal Well right now, and it was made by a guy named Billy Basso. Yeah. And it's like, if one person can make this, and I'm not sure if he had help elsewhere, but I'm pretty sure it was just him. Or like Stardew Valley, or you have small teams like who they make Celeste. Maddie makes games, or Extremely OK Games, who makes Celeste. They're working on a new game, and they're just like this really tiny team of incredibly talented and driven people. And they've come together. They're not a super team that's come together as like multiple indie teams, but you can see that coalescing of talent behind games like Celeste or behind games like Animal Well or Stardew Valley. And you're like, okay, like it's there. Like there are people who are still like uniquely talented in that way. And the games industry is in a bad place, especially the top end of the games industry. But there are so many incredibly talented people, from game designers to developers to artists to, the business people and the producers who can make it happen. That I could see something happening, in the indie space where you have a coming together of something that turns into, something magical as well. The scale of things has changed because the gaming industry has changed so much since Chrono Trigger came out. And, at that time, RPGs, especially in North America on the consoles, were still like a bit of a footnote, right? They had a cap on how many copies they would and could sell, and that was it. And when Final Fantasy VII then came along a few years later, that blew everything out of the water. And all of a sudden the corporations go, oh, hey, these can actually make a ton of money. This can sell millions of copies, not hundreds of thousands of copies. Now we got to clamp down on it. And then you just see, we've watched the suits sort of take over the industry over the past couple of decades. And that changes the type of games that can be made by big studios.
Yeah, it's a bummer. It really is, because, and not to get too negative and pessimistic but it's just the reality of what's kind of happening right now at this very moment when we're recording this. Who knows if things will get better as time goes on, but in any case, with Chrono Trigger, we're not going to see this again. And while it is kind of sad, it does kind of just show how special this game is. Just, even if you hate the game, if you look at it just from like a historical standpoint, that makes this game that much more special that this even occurred. It's really cool. Then, like you mentioned in your article, the seeds of this game were planted when Sakaguchi, Hori, and Toriyama were traveling to the U.S. in 1992 to do some computer graphics research. What I didn't know, reading your article, was that it was originally going to be a Seiken Densetsu game, which is, as we know here in North America, Secret of Mana. Well, that was one of the Seiken Densetsu games. And it was being developed for the Super Famicom disk drive, which obviously the disk drive never came out. So once that once that got scrapped, they had to switch gears, and a lot of the game was completely shifted and like scrapped and reworked and all this other stuff. There's a lot of really cool stuff about this game going into it.
One of the things, just to touch on that a little bit, I think it's really fascinating because if you look at Secret of Mana, there's like a really random, strange portion of the game where you seem to time travel and you end up in like a subway subway tunnel, like in a modern day city. And you're like, there's something there, right? You can see how the bones of something that probably existed. So the project was called like Maru Island. And it was eventually when the Super Nintendo CD fell apart, it was sort of like taken apart and turned into Chrono Trigger and Secret of Mana sort of. And you can see those bones in Secret of Mana. But I also think like the protagonists, like Chrono and Randy, and then Porom and Marl, the two main characters from the two games, like they look very similar. Their designs are very close. And I do wonder, I know that, you know, like Chrono Trigger's designs went through a few iterations and stuff, but it does seem like there's some sort of connection between the games that still exists, even if it's just sort of like a glancing touch on Secret of Mana and Chrono Trigger.
There is definitely some similarity. I didn't even really notice it. I've yet to actually beat Secret of Mana. I've played like bits and pieces of it. I need to get into that at some point.
It's a good one. Yeah.
Some other really quick hits in terms of fun facts. We talked before about how a lot of the almost all the sprites, not everything, we mentioned some pre-rendered stuff, but a lot of the sprites were done by hand. They were hand drawn. That's why they just look stunning. And because of that, and because of the massive soundtrack, this was the first game developed by Square for the Super Nintendo that ran on a 32 megabit cartridge, excuse me. It was going to be on a 24-bit, if I remember correctly, and then they needed basically an extra 68 megs of data just for the graphics alone on that. Like, that took like a quarter of the entire cartridge was just on graphics. And I'm pretty sure, Earthbound is the game that almost a huge chunk of it is music. Yeah. But obviously this still had a whole bunch of music as well. Something that was kind of cool that you wrote in your article, and maybe you can elaborate a little bit more, was Yuji Horii and Hironobu Sakaguchi's relationship and how they worked with each other. Do you remember anything about that you could elaborate a bit on?
I can't. I haven't gone back and read the article in a while. But I think like what stands out is just they both have similar origins, right? Like as you go back and they created their two series, Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, and they sort of took the same blueprint, which was, you know, Western computer RPGs like Ultima and Wizardry. But from the very beginning, they sort of, you know, like took different tacks to gameplay design, story design, the type of games that they wanted to show. And, you know, their personalities are also very different. Like Sakaguchi is known to be fairly difficult to work with, fairly demanding as a boss. Like, you know, while they were making Final Fantasy, like in the early days, his nickname was the King because he was just, you know, like, you know, very hands-on as a boss. Yuji Horii, I think, is just they're different people. And so to have those two kind of equally, like, you know, they're both gravity wells, right? Like there's a reason that they're as successful as they are, and to have those two gravity wells working on a single project could kind of tear it all apart. But I think what happens is you kind of saw a lot of what made Sakaguchi's games compelling, and a lot of that is like interesting structure and the way he likes to tell stories, and his, you know, like his desire to always want to explore gameplay design space. And then you have Yuji Horii, who is always very concerned with accessibility. And so bringing that in, because like Final Fantasy games can feel a little inaccessible to people, especially the ones that are very like gameplay system oriented. But to have somebody like Yuji Horii then kind of bringing that back the other way to make it more approachable for people created a game that I think feels really unique and really highlights and showcases their specific personalities. Their
strengths and weaknesses really complemented each other.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Exactly what you just illustrated with how Sakaguchi and Horii, their approach to video games. Like Horii specifically wanted a silent protagonist because it is easier to write a silent protagonist. You can't make. It was in one of the interviews I was reading. The audience can't hate a silent protagonist. They also can't really love them nearly as strongly. But when you start writing dialogue for your protagonist, you risk having the audience love or hate them. And you know, there's pros and cons is what I'm looking for. I personally am not a huge fan of the silent protagonist, but I'll be damned if they don't make you care about Chrono later on in the game, which we'll get to in a spoiler section.
And in the game, like in Chrono Trigger, and like in Chrono Trigger 2, compared to games like Dragon Quest V, which Horii had just made, or Final Fantasy VI, there was this added level of like player agency in the world of making choices that you almost needed that blank slate character, right? Like you needed Chrono as an avatar of the player because his choices were meant to represent the player's choices rather than more linear kind of story driven more linear story driven games like Final Fantasy VI or Dragon Quest V, where, Final Fantasy VI has a lot of like non-linearity at the end, but it's not about making choice, and it's not about choice and consequence like Chrono Trigger sort of pretends to be. In reality, there is not really any consequence to the time travel. But in 1995, it came across that way, right? Like we didn't really, like, our understanding of like sophisticated games, storytelling, at least mine as a 12-year-old, wasn't great. And it felt like there was consequence to the choices that I was making because, you go back in time, you make an action in the world and it changes something in the future. And that felt consequential. And I don't think that would have worked with like a verbose, like protagonist with a really strongly defined personality. Cause you might want to make a choice that character might not make based on their personality.
And in regards to that choice, like you were saying, like Chrono Trigger gives players more agency a little bit. They did that with this thing called the active time logic system, which was something that allowed the players to move around during cutscenes, and it can also affect dialogue, which I'll be honest, I always forget you can do that. I consistently forget that you can do that. They, in the one interview on Schmupulations, the designer talks about how, like, if you walk away during a boss's monologue, they'll be like, hey, what the hell's wrong with you? And then start a fight with you immediately. So if you're impatient, you can just provoke the fight, which is kind of cool. And you were talking about how, like, because Chrono is a silent protagonist, it allows the player's decisions to have that much more meaning. I also think because he's a blank slate, it allows the strong side characters to shine that much more.
Yes,
so when
absolutely.
Chrono almost serves as a vehicle for their stories as opposed to telling his own or the player's own. And I'm not against that. I actually recently, I actually talked about it a bit on the recent episode on Grand Soul Story, which I should actually tell you a bit more about Aidan off mic. I think you might be interested in that game. But that game kind of has a super simple story, but that's fine, or super simple plot, excuse me, but that's fine because it serves as a vehicle to tell the character's stories. And I think Chrono kind of serves a similar purpose in this game. But yeah, what are your thoughts on the active time logic system? I don't really know if I've seen other games do something like that since. Have you seen many RPGs or otherwise use this kind of system?
I mean, a lot of RPGs, especially once you got into like the PlayStation era, were really focused on, cutscene direction and having, like staging and blocking and camera, movement to the director's, eye. And so you can't really have that same level of, freedom within cutscenes. I think Chrono Trigger still locks you in. Like there are scenes where like a cutscene or dialogue will start and the characters will sort of run into place and you can't move at that point, but you can run around and you can move around a lot throughout the world, especially when talking to NPCs and stuff. And like, I like it, on my 800th playthrough because I can just kind of rip through things that like I've seen it a million times before. And so I can kind of like, trigger something and then keep moving on with the plot. And so I think just creating any sort of ability for players to control the pace of the game is just good, right? And Chrono Trigger introduced a ton of ideas that hadn't really been seen much before in RPGs or video games. And some of them got picked up like New Game Plus and others didn't really get picked up as much as maybe they should have. And that, like any sort of player agency in the game or making things as, quick and speedy and frictionless as possible is can only be a good thing. And I think by the time you get to the PlayStation, RPGs slow down a lot on the PlayStation. And that's something that I think kind of hurts the genre in hindsight. Like it's harder to go back to a lot of the PlayStation RPGs, like even the great ones, because they, feel just that much slower and a little more cumbersome. Everything takes a little bit longer compared to something like Chrono Trigger. And, little touches like, being able to run away from dialogue or just move around while you're in a conversation with somebody really helps that feeling of, just feeling like you're in control and moving things forward always.
I kind of agree with you on that. And I'm honestly a huge fan of the PlayStation Final Fantasies and a lot of PlayStation RPGs, at least the ones that I've played. But like, I love Final Fantasy VII, but the battles are slow. There's lots of time, especially 8 with all the summons. But this isn't a Final Fantasy 7, 8, or 9 podcast. But I can see what you're talking about. I think a lot of that also just dealing with like load times on the PlayStation, It was just the hardware itself loaded more slowly.
I think Xenogears lets you run around in dialogue. Now that I think of it, and Xenogears started life in some capacity as a Chrono Trigger sequel. So I wonder if there's like a little bit of design underpinnings there that
like
that
a spiritual DNA almost.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. Yeah.
I could see that. Well, I want to get into the gameplay now, like kind of just focus in on just how the battle system works. Actually, you know what? Real quick, we've danced around the history of this game a whole bunch. We should probably at least say what the overall plot of this game is.
Sure.
Just for a little bit of context, just in case anyone who has not played it. Now, listeners, we will not spoil anything. I will let you know when we get to a more spoily section of the episode. But basically, the plot of this game is you play as this kind of hapless swordsman named Chrono. I shouldn't say hapless. This kind of like
he's hapless.
He's hapless. Okay, hapless swordsman.
He's like 20, lives at home with his mom, and is super buff. Like all he does is like clearly doesn't have a job, just lives with his mom and works out
all day.
Yeah, like
he's a sword bro. That's what it was.
He is a sword bro for sure. Yeah.
A hapless swordsman named Chrono. You are a supportive friend, though. You are visiting your friend Luca at the fair. I think it's like the Millennium Fair, and you are going there to support her. She has a new invention that she's showing off, and you run into a girl named Marl. Do you say Marl or Marley? I always said Marl.
I say Marl. Yeah.
You say Marl as well. Okay.
Yeah.
So you run into a girl named Marl. She asked you to accompany her. And, oh no, what's going on? Luca is showing off a teleportation device that you use without questioning its safety. Chrono just jumps right in there, gets transported over. Oh, it looks all safe. So Marl wants to do it. And then all of a sudden it reacts to her pendant, and she suddenly gets thrust back into time, and she goes through a portal. You don't actually know where it takes you just yet, but it takes her back in time. So you have to go after her. It leaves her pendant on the ground by the teleporter. Chrono picks it up because he is if nothing else, he is noble and chivalrous, I guess. And he is going after Marl. And you go back in time and you discover there is actually, through your adventures through time, trying to bring Marl back and discovering some other things, which we'll keep to the spoiler section, you discover a bigger existential threat to the world that requires you to jump back and forth through different time eras and zones to help save the world. And that's kind of like the basic overall plot of the game. And it's one of those things where, on the surface, it might sound kind of simple. I shouldn't say simplistic, because anything with time travel is not simple, but at the very least, like that's a really simple overview. I don't know how enticing that would sound to you listeners, but I can guarantee you, if you have not played this, the story is actually really good. There's lots of touching moments. The characters are all really interesting, and I definitely think it's a lot better than I described it. Do you have anything to add to the plot, Aidan, before we go into gameplay?
I do, but it's pretty spoilery, and it touches on, I think, why it's kind of difficult to make Chrono Trigger's plot sound engaging, and it's because the way it handles and introduces conflict at the beginning is super unique. But we will save that for a spoiler section.
Makes sense. And it's frustrating too, because there's some gameplay that I want to talk about specifically at the Millennium Fair that I don't think we can talk about until the spoiler section. So we'll touch on all that. But at the very least, what is not spoilery is the way the game handles exploration and combat. I love how this game handles exploration and combat. I fucking love there's no random battles, and I'm not anti-random battle. I don't mind it as long as the encounter rate is tuned pretty well. But this game doesn't need to worry about that because there's no random. You can walk into an encounter. There's some forced encounters, but by and large, if you want to, you can ignore encounters. You can walk around, especially that first forest when you're going to the Guardia Castle. I think that's the castle, right? Guardia.
Yep.
Where Marl. Well, I was about to spoil something. Maybe I already spoiled it. Who knows? But when you're walking through the forest there, first off, love the song, the forest song there. But when you played enough, if you kind of remember where all the enemies are at, you can ignore all the triggers. You can run all around it. And it's not like you have to be super precise. You just have to kind of figure it out. And through a couple playthroughs, you can figure it, not even, like just through one playthrough, you can start to figure out where those triggers are and you can avoid combat. And it's cool because all the enemies just show up on screen. There's no transition into a battle screen. What you see on the screen is what you see in the battle. And it honestly adds a level of immersion to it where, like, as much as I love Final Fantasy, 6 and 7, a random battle happens, the screen dissolves and transitions, and then you're in a different battle. You're in a different screen. Usually there's a backdrop to make you still feel like you're part of the landscape that you were just in. But Chrono Trigger is none of that. You're exactly on however it's laid out, that's how you see it on the screen. It's really cool.
One of the things I think Chrono Trigger does better than like any game, even modern games, is lots of games since have had like combat on the battlefield, right? But they kind of create a big open, especially when you're in a 3D environment, a big open arena style area for combat. So you'll be in like a dungeon that's, designed like a dungeon. It has verticality, it has tight spaces, it has, like complex design. And then you'll move into like the next room and it'll be a big wide open area. And you're like, oh, okay, I'm going to fight a battle here. Chrono Trigger doesn't do that. It retains kind of complex terrain, complex design, and works its battles into that. So you might have somebody like an enemy who is up higher, like up on top of a ledge, and so they'll throw rocks at you from above. And then once you've defeated one of their the other enemies in that battle, they might do a move where they kind of hop down onto the ground, and then all of a sudden they're using their sword to attack you. And so it doesn't skimp out on complexity in the overworld just to make sort of combat more straightforward. That came at a cost, and the development team has talked about how like having to design and program like every battle in the game was quite taxing, because they'd have to come up with the map design, then they'd have to come up with the encounter, and then the encounters don't just the enemies don't just pop up out of nowhere. There might be animations, there might be little flourishes about how they get into combat or where they come from or what they're doing before or during combat, and all of the bush is moving and then it pops out of there or whatever, and all of that had to be designed and then programmed, and it gives this immersive quality that so few games have managed to achieve since. But it also was highly complex and time consuming for the development team, and I think that that's also one of the reasons why Chrono Trigger is a lot shorter and smaller than a lot of RPGs at that time, because to make one to make a version of Chrono Trigger that was the size of Final Fantasy VI or Dragon Quest VI or Dragon Quest VII would have been exponentially more challenging, because every single fight in the game had to be scripted. Every time you added another combat encounter, that was a whole layer of design work and programming work.
I never even thought about the complexities of what they would have to do for those combat encounters, but you're right. And even just how what's weird about the not weird, but interesting. That's a better term. It's not weird, because weird is normally has a bad connotation. What's interesting about the way they lay out both the enemy layout and the character layout is that the position of your characters matters in this game, which is super interesting, because I'm impressed by this, because you can't control where your characters are placed on the map. For the most part, you have some light control based off how you initiate combat. Like when you run into a combat encounter, sometimes you have a little bit of control there, but a lot of times your characters will go to designated spots. And then from there, it's just how the enemies move on screen and how they push your characters around, because your characters will stay stationary unless they are pushed around by an enemy attack or some other enemy ability. And positioning in this game matters because besides the basic attacks that you get, you can use magic, you can use your basic attacks, you can use items. You also have these things called techs, which are basically like special moves. But what's cool about the techs is that they can either do AoE stuff, which is determined by, like, if you can do it on a single enemy, but obviously you want to try to use them for groups. But you have to make sure you time those attacks well and use them when the enemies are grouped up next to each other, which you have no control over. And on top of that, enemies have AoE attacks, so if your characters are spaced too close to each other, then they can do a lot of damage to you. Now, like I said, you don't really have the ability to move the characters around, so you would think this would be bad. You would think that, like, okay, how is that fair if the enemies can do AoE to me, but I can't move my characters around to strategize it correctly? The game is very fair when they do this. The game doesn't do a lot of AoE attacks on your party, and if they do, they have your characters for the most part split up pretty well, so it's a very rare occurrence when that happens. And they almost give you plenty of time to combat that, in the sense of like, okay, all of us just got hit. Let's make sure we heal up and continue to attack. And now we'll attack that guy who did the AoE so they can't do it again. So the game gives you enough time to see what the enemies are doing to you, strategize on how to counter it, while not necessarily overwhelming you with what was dicking you over in the first place. And likewise with your techs that you can use against the enemies will automatically move. So it's more of a matter of like timing for you. Do you want like to use it at the right time when the enemies are grouped together? The risk reward with that, though, is that it's an active time battle system, which I know you can actually trigger to wait, but I don't know if the enemies stop moving on the wait battle system. I'm not quite sure. Do they stop moving when you use the wait battle system?
I think they do. Yeah, I usually play with weight on. And I think they stop moving if you have weight turned on. Yeah, as soon as you click on like your tech menu or whatever, just select
That's
spell.
what I thought too. And that makes sense, because then that would kind of defeat the purpose of it. But on the active time battle system, where if you're in the middle of your menu selecting whatever you want to do, the enemy's time bars still keep going and they can still do moves and attack you and everything. So you have this risk reward system where it's like, do you want to hold out to get the perfect attack at the risk of getting hit a couple times? Like, do you take a couple hits in the hopes that then you can use your AoE attack and do a whole bunch of damage? Additionally, you get dual and triple techs, where when all of your party members' time bars are filled up, they can all combine for either one move, which is a triple tech, or two of them can combine for one move, which is a double tech. And these techs range from doing specific elemental types of damage to AoE, to crazy amounts for single targets, to healing. Like our Chrono and Marl I used a lot for the Aura Whirl, where basically it looks kind of goofy if you think about it. Marl's basically throwing a cure spell on Chrono's sword, and Chrono just kind of whips it around in a circle and just kind of slashes himself and his friends, and it heals you because cure sword. That makes sense. But it's cool. Like it adds a layer of like just interest. I don't know. I like how simple and straightforward this battle system is, but at the same time, it's not, because your party composition determines which techs you can use in terms of the double and triple. So the game incentivizes you to try out a lot of different party members and cycle through a lot of different characters, because you can unlock new and different and really cool and interesting techs with the different characters that you get. I can't say enough kind things about this battle system.
Yeah, it's cool too, because like every combination of character has dual and triple techs. So like you have you can have there's only 7 playable characters. It's not a huge pool, but, you can go through and you can play the game with any combination of party members, and every combination is viable in its own way. It's not like there are, you don't get the Yuffie and the Vincents like from Final Fantasy VII, which were like, optional characters. They were afterthoughts with clearly like not the same level of depth given to them as the main characters. And so much of like Final Fantasy VII's combat kind of goes through Cloud. Like Chrono Trigger rewards you for picking the team of people and characters that you just love playing with the best. And then you go through New Game Plus, or you play through it again and you play with the team of characters that you never used. You could play Isla and Robo and Frog, which are, probably typically like the second or third character in your party, but you could form a party with all 3 of them, and that's going to change the way you approach combat in a way that just rewards, like you're saying, it just rewards experimentation in a way that lots of games try to do, but few make it feel quite as like rewarding. Because you try something new and you get a result that's really kind of interesting.
And what's interesting too, I know famously, Final Fantasy VI was designed with the idea that there is no main character, and Chrono Trigger, Chrono's kind of the main character because he's the one that you play as primarily. But if you think about it, I think through gameplay, I feel like they achieved that idea in Chrono Trigger a little bit better than in Final Fantasy VI. Final Fantasy VI, I'm not saying that it doesn't achieve it. They do it more through story. They try it through storytelling and cinematics. Versus this, it almost feels like they do it through gameplay, even though that wasn't necessarily the intention of the developers. But the fact, like you just mentioned, you don't have Chrono in that party with Frog, Ayla, and I forget who else. Marl, you might have said. I don't remember who the third person you just said was, but
Robo. I think.
Okay. You don't need Chrono in your party, and that's honestly a good thing at times because you can do so many different and unique things when you're not just kind of saddled with Chrono. And that's not necessarily saying Chrono is bad. He's an awesome character. He's an awesome, like, in terms of combat, he's great. But like, it kind of reminds me like in Final Fantasy IX, I know I keep jumping all over the place with references, with Vivi and Steiner. Like, you almost have to have them in your party because they do such OP attacks. And while that's awesome, it kind of automatically says, well, here, you need your Black Mage for Elemental, you need Steiner for your tank, and you can't remove the two because Steiner and Vivi can do stuff together. No other characters can do stuff with each other for the most part in that game. Versus in Chrono Trigger,
sort of
everyone
spreads it out, right?
Yes. And it just makes it that much cooler. Like, I remember the first time I played it, I didn't care about any of the characters. In the second time, I shouldn't say that. I didn't care about experimenting with the other characters and seeing what all their abilities were. This playthrough that I played for this episode, so different.
Yeah.
I loved seeing all the different things that you could do. There were so many moves and techs that I did not even touch the first time. I'm like, oh, this would have been cool to know. There's so many cool things with it.
Yeah, I mean, the strongest party is one that I typically would never really use or assemble. But my preferred party is just the core 3, Chrono, Luca, and Marl, which is like not the strongest party to go through the game with, but it kind of creates its own rewarding experience because it is like, that is sort of the balanced typical like fighter, mage, healer party. And Marl's quite weak with like physical attacks, has decent magic attacks, but hers magic attacks are sort of more AoE focused, whereas Luca is like very single target magic focused, but has like no healing. And so it's like finding that balance of like, pros and cons to all the characters. Or you can then get into like, you could bring somebody like Frog in who has pretty good physical attacks and also has light healing ability. He's not nearly as good as Marl, but he has it there. And so he can fill in that role. You could swap him out for Marl. You're going to have to be a little more aggressive and win battles faster because you have less access to healing. But, that changes the way you approach combat. And that's interesting, right? Because it's not like you're saying about Final Fantasy IX where it's almost like, like a solved puzzle where it's like, okay, these are the best people to have in your party. You kind of have to have Zidane and Steiner and Vivi. And then you have the fourth member who is sort of an optional character. In Chrono Trigger, you can experiment. No matter who you have, you're gonna have access to the tools you need to win any battle in the game, and not because it's easy necessarily. I wouldn't say Chrono Trigger on a first playthrough is easy. I wouldn't say it's super challenging, but there are bosses in particular that you'll die if you're not paying attention, but you can still get through any of those battles with any combination of characters, and that's unique. I can't think of many RPGs that really will reward you for choosing your own path that way.
I never even really thought about how that. You're 100% right, and what really kind of struck me in what you were just saying there was, Marl is clearly like the best healer out of the group, but you're right. Mm-hmm. Frog has light healing abilities. Robo, when you get him up a little bit higher, he gets healing abilities with his I don't know if it's Cure Beam or something like that. Yeah. He gets healing abilities. Obviously, anyone can heal with items and whatnot if you do that. But that alone, that is about half your characters that you get access to that you can heal with, with items, just with their inherent abilities. And that is really kind of awesome. And I'm trying to double check. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There is a total of 7 different playable characters in the game. But even so, 3 out of 7 that you can heal with, that almost guarantees you, unless you really want to have a really difficult time.
Isla can actually heal as well a little bit.
Yeah.
Isla has a really weak single target heal spell that comes in handy.
There you
sometimes. Go. So that's 4 out of 7. Yeah.
Now, real quick, we should at least talk about who the characters are. I won't go into the spoiler things for some of these characters, but you have Chrono, who is your red-haired, spiky, silent protagonist, according to Wikipedia. That, as they describe in the first sentence there. But then you also have Marl, who is the person you ran into at the Millennium Fair in the beginning of the game. You have Luca, who is Chrono's childhood friend. She's crazy smart. She is the inventor of the gang, and you can see that in a lot of her texts. All of her elemental attacks are like flamethrower or ice or something like that. It feels not that she's using magic, but that she's using science to create these elements, which is kind of cool. It feeds into her character, which is really cool. Frog, which we've referenced already, is an anthropomorphic frog, and his story is awesome. I love Frog's story. I appreciated it a lot more this time around. You have Robo, which he's from the future. Like we said, there is you do time travel, so you do get someone from a bunch of different time periods. Robo is from the future. He's a futuristic robot. Ayla is the chief of a prehistoric tribe, and you conscript her, or she joins your party. And then Magus is an interesting character, which I don't want to say anything about right now, because he's kind of pivotal to the story in lots of many apparent and non-apparent ways, and we'll get into all that. But yeah, so those are all the characters you can have as part of your party, and each of them have different strengths and weaknesses, as we've gone over. I also really like that there's no really clear defining roles per se for them. You could maybe say Frog is a paladin, sort of, because he has some light healing abilities, like you would see a paladin would in World of Warcraft or something like that, or any other kind of Western RPG. Chrono, you could maybe say, if anything, he's the hero or the knight. Marl is definitely supposed to be a healer, but she also has does she have ranged attacks? Now I'm blanking on it. Luca has ranged attacks.
She uses a bow, and she uses magic, ice magic. That's generally not. It's more AoE. And she's not really some of the other characters, like Robo especially has to be close to enemies to use a lot of his attacks. Marl can kind of isn't inhibited by distance. So yeah,
that's what I thought. Robo is kind of if anything, I don't know what you would describe. Would you kind of call him a blue mage? Maybe not really, because he doesn't learn abilities, but he's a little bit of a tank, but he also has lots of different elemental abilities. Ayla is probably the closest thing to a berserker.
Mm-hmm.
but even she's not a berserker. It's
she's also your thief, like she's also the one that can steal stuff and has healing and can taunt enemies and stuff. And that's the thing is like they don't fit neatly into boxes because their gameplay design is based off their personality and their place in the world and their conflicts and their goals, rather than we need a mage, we need a paladin, we need a thief. They created characters. Now, I don't know for sure that they created the characters first, then came up with the gameplay, but they feel that way. They feel like, they have abilities and uses in battle that are defined by who they are, not like what the gameplay design docs sort of laid out before they started writing the story.
And that's really cool to me. I feel like it very much feels like the story dictated. They used the gameplay to reinforce the narrative as opposed to letting the narrative fit around the gameplay, if that makes sense. Which not saying that one is better than the other. I personally prefer it. I think it's a lot harder to achieve well when designers use gameplay to reinforce their narrative to aid in telling the story. Because that's hard to do. It can be very hard to do, especially in games where there's lots of repetitive game mechanics like in RPGs, but they do it pretty damn well in this. One other thing in terms of gameplay that I want to bring up before we go on to like music and visuals, we've already kind of touched on both of them, but we can dive in a little bit more with them. With exploration, while exploring the world, there's lots of treasure chests that you can come across, and there are some that some people don't like this, and I can understand where they're coming from. I'd be curious to hear your take on it, Aidan, where there's some chests that you will find where you don't want to open them at when you first get to it. It'll ask you, hey, are you sure you want to open this? It could, it's pretty valuable in here. And if you say no and go like time travel ahead and open it. I know this is kind of spoilery, but I feel like this is something that some people might be a little cranky on if they miss, so I don't mind. This is a very mild spoiler. I'm not even going to say where these chests are, so they may not even encounter it. But if you try to open them and then you say no, you time travel forward and go to the same spot, open those chests now, it's a better version of the item that was in there. And then if you travel back in time, back to what they originally were, you can get that original item too. So you can kind of cheese the game a little bit, but you have to initiate it first. You still have to try to open the chest in the past and then travel to the future to get the better item. That doesn't happen often. I don't really have too much of an issue with that. But I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, Aidan. Do you like that? I think it's cool for gameplay, but do you find it fair, or were you a fan of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think back in the day, if I remember correctly, like on my first playthrough, I just opened all the chests, right? And then I got the moon armor instead of the Nova armor or whatever. But I think in a game like Chrono Trigger, where it is a time travel story, right? But there aren't really a lot of permanent consequences in the game. The story, as choice filled and non-linear as it looks from the outside, it is all kind of baked, right? Like there is only one conclusion to pretty much every story beat in the game, outside of like Luca has a side quest that you can mess up, and then there's the story changes, the future changes, but for the most part, it's a game about cause and effect that doesn't actually have a lot of like cause and effect or variable cause and effect. And so I do like the chests because it does sort of ask the player to stop for a second and think, break outside of that typical, programmed reaction of, oh, I'm going here, I see a chest, I'm going to open it and take it. It asks you to be a little patient, to think through like, hey, this is a time travel game. Why is this asking me if I want to open it? Wait, if it's here now in 600 AD, is it still there in 1000 AD? So it just kind of like asks the player to engage on that like slightly deeper level. It gives you some pretty good gear as well, which is always kind of interesting. But the backup gear that you get is also okay, right? Like it's, if you get the thing that cuts fire damage by 50% instead of like 100%, like obviously not as good, but cutting fire damage by 50% is still pretty darn good.
Yeah.
And it also incentivizes those future playthroughs where you're like, oh, I missed that treasure chest. And now it's not like you're starting from scratch. You're playing through again, you have your full inventory, and it's like, oh, now this time I want to make sure to get the Nova armor instead of just the Moon armor so I can kind of complete my inventory. So, like I think that, it's a low stakes sort of interaction in the game that has real consequences that aren't, they don't hurt too bad because the game is sort of designed around these ideas from a narrative perspective and from like a, new game plus replay the game, learn from your mistakes sort of perspective.
Yeah, I could see that. I guess the only thing I would have, at least in terms of the new game plus, the only I guess pushback I would offer for the new game plus thing is that if you don't know that that's what the chests are doing in the first playthrough, you probably aren't going to figure it out for the second one. Like you might try it just as like say, okay, well I hit yes for this one, let me try no for this one, but then you'd also have to figure out to like go ahead in the future and try opening it up later. I'm not saying it's necessarily bad. I like you said as well, if the game asks you like, are you sure you want to open this? They don't do that for any other chest, so it's exactly supposed to stick out in your mind's eye, I guess.
And like there are regular
thoughts?
chests.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
There are regular chests too that like when you're the first time you're in Guardia Castle, you're running up a tower and there's some chests and you open it up, you get an ether or a healing potion or something. And you can open it up and you can get it right then and there. You might need it. But if you are like patient and you wait until you go back to like 1000 AD, you go to Guardia Castle again, that chest is still in the tower and it's closed or open depending on what you did in 600 AD. So you can wait, and if you're patient, you get 2 ethers. So like there are instances as well where the game subtly shows you that like, oh, hey, remember how you opened that chest in 600 AD? Now you're in that same tower and it's open. What does that tell you? Right? So like the game does sort of show you that cause and effect in a less consequential way earlier in the game, hoping to train the player, I think, so that when they see that message of, are you sure you want to open this chest? They're like, maybe I don't want to open this chest. So I do think there's enough there that most people would probably clue in at this point, or even back in the day.
Oh, I guarantee you I wouldn't, but I'm also dense, so I don't know if you can really use me as the metric for that. I was going to ask, is there any final thoughts you have on gameplay before we touch on music and graphics?
I think I just want to like come back around to like how quick and like polished the experience is, and how I wish more modern games would take that away. Like the way that the story moves from like story beat to story beat to story beat, ties its plot points in with character motivations and character conflicts, and makes everything fast. Like it's very like the game is very vignette based, but like nowhere really takes, like no story beat really takes more than 20 minutes, maybe half an hour tops, before you're sort of like you've resolved that conflict and started the next thing, and it builds and it builds and it builds. And you look at games like even like Sea of Stars, which came out last year.
I think it was last year.
Excellent game. Like amazing game. I love it. And, the creative team behind it has cited Chrono Trigger as a major inspiration. And I think it pulls a lot of interesting things from Chrono Trigger, but it still doesn't quite nail that, like, like almost episodic, like compulsive story pacing that Chrono Trigger has. And they do everything that they can for the player to continue forward and move forward without removing friction. It doesn't become like some of the modern games that feel like you're sort of just watching an interactive movie. Like Chrono Trigger still requires a lot of agency, but it never really gives you a good opportunity to put the game down. And I think that's something I would love to see modern RPGs, modern games in general, continue to explore how that game did it so well in 1995.
I think what you just touched on there is something I agree we didn't in general touch on enough during our conversation just a bit ago. The pacing of this game. You already talked about like with the different kind of like episodic nature of the storytelling in this. What I think is interesting about this game in terms of the way it paces it is that it's pretty breakneck, but it doesn't feel like it. It gives players enough downtime in between story beats, so it doesn't feel like you're constantly like, oh god, another huge like story shattering, story altering event. It doesn't feel like that. It just feels like a really well paced game, and I think the reason it does so well with that, the way it's not a perfect comparison, but I think it kind of reminds me a little bit of how Game of Thrones, like early Game of Thrones, told its stories, where each episode would end with like you have a full episode, you have some interesting plot beats, and you get some progress with the story, and then the last 2 to 3 minutes of the episode they would give you just enough of a not a plot twist but a plot teaser for the next episode after that you'd be like, oh shit, what's going to happen next? And I think the way this game does that, where without going into spoilers too much, we'll just talk about what we've already brought up before. You go to the Millennium Fair, you explore around the Millennium Fair, you kind of partake in all of its stuff. You get a bunch of mini games, which is a really interesting way to start an RPG with just a bunch of mini games. But you play some mini games, and then all of a sudden you get thrust back into time. So then you have to start figuring out what happened to Marl, where did she go, what's going on back here. Then you solve that problem, and then you come back in time now, and because of the way you kind of disappeared in going back in time, it caused issues in your present day. In 1000 AD is the present day for Chrono and Marl and Luca. And so then you have to solve those issues in 1000 AD, which then caused you to travel to a different time period, which I won't name just yet, just because I don't want to spoil too much. But it paces it out where, the Millennium Fair you get to experience, and then that little, last 2 minutes of the episode to continue the Game of Thrones comparison is jumping back in time and Marl disappearing. So then you do the whole Marl episode, and then you jump back to the present day, and what's the little last 2 minutes? The problems that occurred because of you going back in time together. And then you have that episode, and that what's the last 2 minutes? Jumping to the different time period. And they do just enough to give you these breadcrumbs to make you want to advance the story. And like you said, each episode, as it were, isn't that long. It's like maybe 20 to 30 minutes, maybe longer depending on the difficulty, but there's plenty of save points, and you can save anywhere on the open world, on the world map. So it never feels like you're actually getting dicked over by the pacing or how long it is in between story beats. Like there's plenty of time for you to save, plenty of time for you to breathe, but also it gives you those breadcrumbs that make you want to continue on with the story.
Yeah. And it also does Chrono Trigger is interesting because it is very sort of linear in the way that you're describing at the beginning of the game. For the first half of the game, it's sort of like, set piece story beat, set piece story beat, set piece story beat, in a way that has that avalanche effect that you're talking about. As every story beat wraps up, it leads into and creates a conflict for the next story beat. And that lasts about halfway through the game. And then there's this big sort of climactic event, and then the structure of the game after that changes again in a way that's similar to Final Fantasy VI, in terms of then you get to a point where the world is wide open. You can explore pretty much everywhere and do a bunch of side quests in any order that you want to. But what I think is really interesting about Chrono Trigger is that at that point, it gives you a hub area that you kind of all of your adventuring goes through. And the hub area, and it acts like this during the first half of the game as well, but it gives you that opportunity to stop and breathe when you need to. It gives you access to the rest of the world in a way that allows the player to kind of dictate momentum through the story, without breaking up the story into something that, causes somebody to want to put it down. And I think that's something that's really important in any sort of epic story. I mean, any story period, but epic fantasy or RPGs is creating these worlds that you want to spend time in and live in. And you talked about the mini games at the Millennial Fair, and I think that's a big part of it. creates a world that feels like a real place with real people living in it that you want to save and preserve. It feels like a good place that needs to be preserved. And Chrono Trigger, by having this hub that you constantly are running through, you have and retain access to the different, eras that you can travel through, but you also have the ability to sort of like slow down or diverge off the main path in a way that doesn't like arrest story momentum, but gives the player a little bit of agency in a way that many RPGs at the time didn't really have. You weren't able to necessarily, go out and spend time in the world when you're in the middle of sort of the major story plot beats. And I think Chrono Trigger's use of a hub world is really interesting in that way. It's a place where you can stop and you can gather your team, you can heal up, you can get advice on where to go next. And it also just feels like home. It's that moment to breathe before you're on to that next plot beat.
Agreed. I love the storytelling in this game, man. I didn't even think we were going to be able to touch on it without spoiling anything, but I think we did a pretty damn good job there of describing how the story is told without actually telling what the story is. That's pretty cool.
Yes, absolutely.
Let's move on to graphics and music. We've already touched a little bit on it, and then after that we can go into our spoiler wall discussion. The graphics and visuals are just everything about the presentation in general with this game is I can't think of a better word than perfect. Maybe not perfect, but it's as close to perfect as you can get. The hand-drawn sprites are stunning. I like the campfire scene that everyone references is beautiful. The stained glass in the courtroom scene is in the which we won't say why there's a courtroom scene until the spoiler section that I keep bringing up. I'll have to stop doing that so frequently. But the stained glass is beautiful. Magus's castle. I didn't when replaying it. The scope of that thing was. I couldn't believe it. It's funny because the first time I played it, it didn't really impress me all that much. And I don't know why. Maybe I just wasn't looking for it. Maybe I just wasn't really paying enough attention. But this time I was in awe of it. It was huge. Like the way they drew that, like that's not a sprite. That was just a full, like one of the things they talked about in the behind the scenes thing is that there was very little reused tiles and sprites in this game, and you can see it. Like there's so much uniqueness to almost every area of the game in every time period. Like it really feels like they put so much effort into this game, both visually and obviously shout out to Yasunori Mitsuda for the soundtrack of this game, because it is one of the best soundtracks of all time. Not just saying it's good music. It is by far one of the best soundtracks of all time in video games, just period.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of touched on how remarkable the Yasunori Mitsuda's work on the soundtrack was at such a young age, and as somebody who was inexperienced, and there was a human cost to that too. And he put himself in the hospital with stomach ulcers from stress and overwork, which became sort of a thing in his career. And that's when Uematsu had to step in and finish the last, few tracks for the game. And so, I think you have this touchstone game with elements that are so unique across gameplay, like we've talked about, like story, but the visuals and the music coming in and having the music. Yasunori Mitsuda has always had this sort of Celtic influence that I think was, started to feel really unique within Chrono Trigger, especially in its sequel Chrono Cross. But I think also just Square Enix's willingness to like experiment and take risks, taking on, an inexperienced audio engineer as like the main composer for Chrono Trigger, giving them access, and giving them the 32 megabit cart so that they could fit stuff like Magus's castle on there. I think that was one of the things they wanted to add, was that, vertical panning shot of Magus's castle. And it was so big, they needed extra space. And if you take if you look at the game asset, like the game files, you can find that background. It's one image. But as the castle rises up, there's like the moon behind it, right? And it's a parallax effect as the camera scrolls. But if you take the castle away, you can see the moon. And in the middle of the moon, there's just no visual data. It's just like a solid color. So they were cutting everything that they could. The castle covered that portion of the mood in the middle. So they cut out any texture data or anything that might have contributed to extra space. And so really just allowing the company or the creative team to like push every single boundary, to take risks, to try things that, you know, may not work or may add expense or may, you know, create a bigger game or a more complex game. Do it. And when you assemble the talent that you have the Mitsudas, you have Akira Toriyama, you have the pixel artists who work on the game. Those come together and risks become, you know, those gambles become more worthwhile because they're more likely to succeed. And I think you just see that in every facet of the game. It just feels like it oozes quality and polish, and an inexperienced team couldn't have done that. And on the flip side, you know, a team with as much experience and ego as, you know, that creative team behind Chrono Trigger, it could have gone the other way. Like we've talked about, it could have been a big clash of ego and the end result could have been a mess. But instead we got this sort of perfect conflagration of talent and, you know, business, like risk analysis that came together to create something that really shouldn't have worked, but came out wonderfully. Well, and like I think we should also, I don't actually know the pixel artist or who was doing the pixel art on the game, but one thing that I was when I was writing the Chrono Trigger history piece that you've referenced a few times, one of my favorite facts that I found out about it is that the pixel artists had to create a lot of the art in the game on their own. So Akira Toriyama did the art and did the key art and the world design, but he actually only produced a small handful of images for the game, and concept art. So he didn't do like nowadays you have games have thousands and thousands of pieces of concept art. Toriyama provided a handful of sort of world like art pieces, and that's what we've seen. It came as posters in the game, and you know it's been used as key art and promotional art for the game forever, but that's what he created. And then he created the characters, like the pictures of the characters on the Japanese box art, you can kind of see them. But my favorite story is that he only drew the characters from the front. He didn't do like, you know, a more traditional character design where he sketched them from the front and the sides and the back. And so you had the pixel artists got this concept art from Toriyama, and they went, okay, well, like, what does the rest of Chrono look like? And so they had to kind of create that based on, you know, just the impression of his art, and they had to come up with the look of the characters from behind and then the look of, you know, enemies in the game to fit that style. And I think they deserve a lot of credit. And as I say that, I don't even know the names of the pixel artists. I don't think it was Shibuya who did a lot of the Final Fantasy stuff. You know, Akira Toriyama gets so much of the credit, and, you know, like for good reason. But, you know, the rest of the team, again, you go down that list of credits and it's like all of these people were working at the peak of their abilities in a medium that they were extremely comfortable with, and that shows.
According to Wikipedia, the other artists, I don't know if they're pixel artists. Obviously, they credit Akira Toriyama, but there's Yasuhiko Kamada, Masanori Hoshino, and Tetsuya Takahashi. So I don't know if those were the pixel artists, but those are credited as artists.
Takahashi famously created like Xenogears and now Xenoblade as well. So when we're talking about like, you know, the people on these games, like he was working as an artist on Chrono Trigger, probably a pixel artist, because he also created the, you know, at the beginning of Final Fantasy VI, the mechs walking towards Narshe. He created that. He was an artist on Chrono Trigger, and now he's created one of the biggest, you know, he's the creator along with his wife of one of the biggest RPG franchises in the world, like Nintendo's number one. And so like that, just like, and the fact that he's sort of buried down the credits list like that is just remarkable, because he's had a career and he's created series and games that are, you know, are legendary at this point. And he was, you know, he was just another staffer on Chrono Trigger. It's wild.
It's bonkers. There's no other way to describe this game, just but bonkers. So we're gonna move on to the spoiler section of the episode. Like we've said a bunch of times, this game's fantastic. So if you do not want to be spoiled for this game, both Aidan and I are in agreement. This is a fantastic game. It's one of the most important games, not just because it's good, but because of what it represented with the dream team. The dream team is like, that's an overused term in gaming history, I should say, just because, how many times did Nintendo use it to describe its third-party developers and stuff like that? Like, you just don't see stuff like this. So the fact that all these came together, and as Aidan said many times over the course of our conversation, like, these were these were juggernauts of their craft. And it would have been very easy for Ego to win out from one side or the other and make it impossible to make a good game. But Ego did not win out. They complemented each other, and it worked out super well. And this game's fantastic. So if you have not played it, please go give it a play. Even if you're not into JRPGs, it's worth at least trying just to see what it's like. You can, I don't, if you find a ROM of it, delete it within 24 hours to be a good law-abiding citizen, but you can go check it out in some way, shape, or form.
The Steam version is very good now. It was not good when it launched. It's very good now, and it's regularly on sale for like the price of a cup of coffee. So that's usually my go-to recommendation for people these days if they're not going the emulation route. Steam version is very good, and there's great user mods as well.
And tell Square Enix that we want more Chrono in the Chrono series games. Let them know that we're still begging for this. So we're going to move on to the spoiler section and the spoiler wall and all that other stuff. So you have all been forewarned. We are here at the spoiler wall. I want to kick this off, Aidan, with, I guess, just a real quick. How I want to do this is because, there's lots of stuff to talk about. There's so many different things we could go into. But I think at the very least, just explain the basic story, and then we can talk about our favorite elements, so our favorite side stories, because I think the side quests where a lot of this really like shines, in my opinion. So just as a real quick overview of the plots and the spoiler of the game is after, Chrono and everyone goes back in time, you find out there that Marl is actually right beforehand, that Marl is the princess of Guardia Princess Nadia is her real name, but she goes by Marl because she doesn't want people to know who she is, to, not think of her any different. She's just an average person, and she wants people to think of her as an average person. And you go back in time, she gets mistaken for her ancestor, Queen Lean, which, if you are paying attention, the beginning of the game opens with Chrono's mother saying, "Oh, Lean's bell is ringing," and it sounds or something along those lines. So you can already see like the little breadcrumbs the game is like leaving for you as you go along, and you go visit her in Guardia Castle back in 600 AD, 400 years prior to the events, or to where you're at in your time, and you go meet Marl in the castle, and then all of a sudden she disappears, because at this time Queen Lean was kidnapped, and since they called off the search for her, Marl would cease to exist, because the real Queen Lean is still kidnapped and therefore is never found. And so because the real Queen Lean is never found, Marl ceases to exist. That entire timeline is erased. So you have to go track down the real Queen Lean, which is also where you meet Frog, and Queen Lean rhymes. I didn't realize it, how many times I've been saying it. You meet Frog, and he is one of the coolest characters ever. He is that anthropomorphic frog, and we'll get into his backstory when we get to kind of the character side stories and everything. You can choose to have him in your party or not. I think, does he force himself to come along with you, or can you choose to not have him in your party?
He forces his way in, because it's just you and Luca go into the cathedral, and then he saves you from some Nagas and then joins your party at that point.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, I always liked Frog, so I always wanted him to be part of my party. So you do end up saving Queen Lean, and because you save her, Marl is now saved, and so you go back to the present day at 1000 AD, and because Princess Nadia, Marl, disappeared, they blame you, the Chancellor, which is kind of like, he's a douchebag. I'm going to be honest. I hate the Chancellor, and he's always the guy that end up getting impersonated by some bad guy in almost every time period. It's kind of annoying, but kind of funny at the same time. But ends up throwing you.
Yeah,
sorry,
that's part of the plot at the time, because they explained that like 600 or 400 years ago, the queen was kidnapped. So the like chancellor back then was like, we need, like a more robust justice system. And so like, like then that has a, tag along effect of then the chancellor that 400 years later is a big jerk, big authoritarian jerk. And so it sort of explains that like, you saved Marl and the queen and all that, but you also created like this sort of authoritarian Guardia kingdom. It's funny.
It's a big theme throughout this game of just how stuff in the past affects the future, and you reference it a little bit in our earlier in the episode about how like this game plays real fast and loose with time travel, in the sense like there's no butterfly effect in this. It's basically one thing. If you change one thing in the past, it will only affect one thing in the future, at least in terms of the game's logic.
It really sets up this idea of like temporal like paradoxes, right? Like you change something in the past and then the whole future changes, with the like, Marl getting kidnapped and the queen disappearing and all that. And then that never really comes up again in the game. Like there are no other like paradoxes or like time conflicts later on in the game, which is one of my, I guess, disappointments, if you can call it that. They could never really figure out how to make that level of like consequence for not achieving your goals in the past.
They kind of play with it a little bit with the side stories of like the three mystics, I think is what they are. They kind of play with it with those characters. But yeah, you're right. They really, in terms of main story like that they focus on, they don't really do it again in the rest of the game. But you get put on trial, and all the stuff you did in the Millennium Fair comes back either to haunt you or to aid you. The only real kind of kicker is that it doesn't matter. You get thrown into prison regardless. You get, like, if you're found not guilty, which you can do, if you play the Millennium Fair in a very particular way, which I actually remember all of it, like bring the cat back to the little girl, leave the old man's lunch alone. Also, if you bump into Marl, because they're going to ask, did you bump into her? Did she bump into you? You most likely answer, you bumped into her. And then you go to check on her first to see if she's okay. And then you go pick up her necklace, bring it right back to her. And then also right before you see Luca's presentation, she's like, Chrono, I want to, look at this. Can we stop and shop for a second? And then you do that and you just have to wait. Like you can walk around and leave and all this other stuff, but you can't. If you do that, then the chancellor will be like, see, a eyewitness told me you're a piece of shit. So for not waiting for her, how dare you? How very dare you? And so that's how you kind of you can get that not guilty verdict. But in the end, it doesn't matter because the chancellor's a piece of shit and he decides to hang you anyway. He basically tells the guards a lie that you were found guilty in the trial, and he throws you in prison anyway. And so you have to escape. And you can either choose, I think you can choose to wait for Luca to come help you, or you can escape yourself. Am I right with that?
Yeah, so when you're in the prison cell, you can go and rattle the bars a few times, and then one of the guards comes in and you fight them and knock them out and escape on your own. But you can also just wait out the 3 days and it'll tell you how many days remaining. And then the guards will take you out of the prison cell and they'll take you up like through the castle. And then Luca will kind of barge in at the last moment and save you, cutting out like 90% of the dungeon, which is kind of cool. And something that like I didn't even know you could do for years, because I would always just break out on my own. And then I kind of discovered that if I just wait, it's like, oh, I just skip like most of this dungeon, which you don't really want to do on a first playthrough because there's some good gear in there. You want the experience. And crucially, you can also save Fitz, who is the son of a shopkeeper in town. And it's a cute little side story. And if you go through the whole dungeon, you can save him and then he doesn't get beheaded. And who wants Fitz to be beheaded?
Not I. I didn't even know that was a side story. See, there's stuff I'm learning about this game, even like a decade after I first played it. There's a lot of really cool little like things that the game kind of touches on. And it's actually worth breaking out, because if you explore that dungeon, not only do you get some valuable experience and leveling up stuff, but you also get some decent items. There's like some better gear for Chrono if you explore all over, which I really liked. But yeah, and after you do escape, is whether you escape or Lucas saves you, do you end up fighting that dragon thing no matter what if Lucas saves you?
You always fight the dragon tank. Yeah, no matter which path you take.
I love the dragon tank fight. That is
it's good. Yeah, it's
so
great
fun.
fight.
And if the game rewards you for exploration, if you explore and you read the guard's diary or whatever it is on the journal at his desk, it tells you the strategy of how to beat the dragon tank, which is really cool. Also the visual of like this game. I know like Final Fantasy VI is known for being so cinematic, especially with its cutscenes. I feel like there's so many, like, not necessarily cutscenes in Chrono Trigger, but just visual moments that just feel cinematic. The dragon tank is one of them, especially with the parallax scrolling of the stuff in the background when you're walking across those bridges. I already mentioned the campfire. I already mentioned oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the other thing. Oh, the stained glass, Magus's castle. Also, even like when you, spoiler with Chrono, when you revive him, you know that whole by the tree, that's really beautiful too. Like it really is like there's just so many moments that feel cinematic through gameplay as opposed through cinematics, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, you escape and then you're on the run from the guards, and Marl comes with you this time because she's cranky
Crucially,
at her
though,
dad.
when the dragon tank explodes, it like blasts out part of the bridge, but then the Chancellor and the soldiers sort of like grab onto each other and form like a human bridge. So you get to like run over top of them, and they kind of yell at you every time you run on top of them. And I always run back and forth a few times because, like you said, like nobody likes the Chancellor. Like,
No,
you got to give him a couple of little, you know, like couple little stomps on the way through. But those are sort of those cinematic moments, those like, you know, like staging moments where the story just goes a little bit above and beyond in terms of how it, you know, like creates like visual humor, visual storytelling in the world.
I agree, man. Just going through the story, I forgot how funny that was to me. You use them like a human bridge. Very, very Toriyama style humor too, in a good way.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But you escape the castle, and then you end up having you're cornered, so you have to run out to the forest, and you can only get away to one corner of the forest, and it is a portal, and it's another time portal, and you haven't quite figured out how to determine, you know, which portals take you to which time periods, and why are they taking you to specific time periods, and why is it 600 AD for the first one, and why is it now jumping you all the way up to, I think it's like 2300 AD if I remember correctly. And this is now post-apocalyptic, and you're going through this post-apocalyptic wasteland where literally there's machines that keep you alive, but you still feel hungry. It's meant to be very dystopian, where humans live, but they're not really alive, if in a kind of a metaphorical sense. And you find out how the world came to be in this place. I know I'm skipping over some other stuff, so you can feel free to jump back, Aidan, if there's stuff you want to highlight in this section. And we are starting to run low on time, so I'm going to kind of touch on what the big overarching plot is here, because in this 2300 AD is where it gets revealed that this creature from the sky, Lavos, fell to the earth like ages ago and is buried deep within the earth, and it finally erupts. I forget the exact age. It's like 1200 AD? No. It gives a specific... Oh, sorry, 1999. Yes, excuse me. 1999 is when Lavos erupts.
Get a party. Yeah.
And causes the apocalypse, and what's left is just the humans surviving in these like different domes with technology and whatnot. This is also where you meet Robo, and he joins your party, or it joins your party. And this was a part in your article that I really liked that you pointed out, is that what the characters decide in this moment. They see this existential threat happen, and they're not going to be affected by it. Period. It happens. They're at 1000 AD. This isn't happening for another 999 years. Like, they are going to live. They're going to live and die and not have to deal with this existential threat. But what they do is that they choose to be altruistic, which is, it kind of lends into the whole idea of Chrono Trigger just having a very hopeful and optimistic outlook on people, which is surprising because you don't always see that. Like, especially, I feel like as I've gotten older, I've become a little bit more pessimistic. So I really gravitate towards things that promote optimism in a way that feels a little bit more grounded as opposed to just straight up like blind optimism. And I almost feel like Chrono Trigger kind of balances that a little bit. I'm not saying it does it well because it's pretty optimistic overall with these very altruistic characters. But you mentioned Marl is the one that kind of like spearheads this whole thing. Is there anything you'd like to like kind of go into with that, with the whole idea of these characters just even though they're not going to be affected by it, like still going through and trying to stop Lavos from doing what it's going to do?
Yeah, and so earlier, I think this is the most fascinating part about Chrono Trigger overall, is the way that it kind of creates agency in its story. And I think earlier in the episode, I mentioned how I think this is the reason it's hard to do an elevator pitch of Chrono Trigger's story, because a lot of the time in stories like this, you have conflict. That's, Final Fantasy VI is you play as Terra. She is, she's been, experimented upon. She's a super soldier within the Empire, and now she's escaping the Empire. That's a reactionary response to external conflict that is coming after her, right? Mm-hmm. She's responding to a situation that puts her at harm's risk. Like you said, and like I wrote about in my article, Chrono Trigger doesn't do that. It starts off, you go to the Millennial Fair, there's no conflict, right? Until you bump into Marl and you make a friend and you're kind of going out on this, impromptu date with Marl. Then there's conflict when she disappears, but that's still sort of on a personal level, right? Like, it's mysterious. You need to get your friend back, but it's not like, it's not like Guardia is all of a sudden getting invaded. It's not like she got kidnapped by a wizard who like has nefarious plans to use her to whatever, right? Mm-hmm. She just disappeared through an accident. So you go after her. There's conflict there. The queen is missing. The kingdom thinks, Marl is the queen. And then the whole cause and effect thing where she might not exist in the future. Like, that's good conflict. But again, it's fairly personal. The scale gets a little bit bigger. Then you go back to the present. You go through Chrono's conflict, which is he gets thrown in jail for something he didn't do. But these are all like solvable within the sort of like episodic, structure that we talked about. They're all sort of personal stakes. They're all focused on like, oh, this bad thing is happening to this specific person, but it's not putting the world at threat, right? It's not threatening the livelihood of the people who live in a fairly idyllic sort of like, faux utopian fantasy world. Like 1000 AD is like, it's a pretty good place to live as far as fantasy worlds go, right? Yeah. So then you have this instance where they're thrown into the future and they see actual hurt. They see people hurting. They don't know these people, right? They could, go back home and be like, well, that sucked. Like that was weird. But that doesn't happen that's for 1300 years from now. The world doesn't end for 1,000 years. Life's pretty good right now. Right. The future is sort of is a stand-in for climate change. It's a stand-in for the way that we can't use technology to fill in the human gaps in our societies. Right. Like, we can't survive off technology alone. We can't expect technology to save us from climate change and from the world, going through this horrible transformation. We have to do it ourselves. And when Marl sees on the video in the future the cause of all of that despair and destruction, she says, we got to fix this. Not because it will save her, not because it'll, make any difference at all to the life that she could go back and live very happily. She's a princess. She chafes under her dad's sort of roof, but what, teenager doesn't, she can go back and live this fairly extremely privileged life. But she doesn't. She says, we need to fix that. How do we fix that? And she propels the plot forward. The plot doesn't come to her. She creates the plot. And through Marl, the plot gets propelled. And I just think that that's such a fascinating way to build a story, whether it's in an RPG or whether it's in a book or whether it's in a film, when you have a protagonist who is creating the plot, not reacting to plot that's coming at them. And it doesn't happen very often. It's a hard thing to write. It's a hard thing to conceptualize. And it's also like, it's a hard thing to sell in the beginning of a game. And how many times are there probably instances where you have somebody who wants to write sort of that slow build up beginning? Like, I don't know if you've read Tad Williams' Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, but it has sort of a similar thing where it has this really slow burn opening where it's basically just the main character, Simon. He's a kitchen scullion, kind of getting up to like misadventures around the castle for like 150 pages before anything happens. And I love it. It's amazing. It's my favorite trilogy. That first 150 pages turns so many people off. It turned me off the first couple times I tried to read it. Chrono Trigger could get away with it because it's Hironobu Sakaguchi, it's Yuji Horii, it's Akira Toriyama. And they had that benefit of the doubt, and nobody could really tell them no at that point. And it created something that I think is pretty magical, and something that's like just as rare as any of the other elements in the game. You know, from the graphics to the combat and gameplay being as, you know, pristine as they are. You know, that ability to tell a story that sort of defies, you know, the truisms that underpin a lot of narratives in video games and RPGs. Being able to do that is something that really sets Chrono Trigger apart.
And a lot of that, what you just talked about, is reflected even in the side stories, which I want to get into real quick here, just because, like I said, we are running low on time, and like I feel like we could go another 40 minutes on this. So I don't, but I don't want to.
I mean, Cole's notes is basically they find out that Lavos was being summoned. He destroyed the planet, creating 2300 AD in the post-apocalypse. They catch wind that maybe a mage in 600 AD named Magus might have summoned Lavos. They go back to 600 AD to defeat Magus. They defeat him, and he went, "What are you guys doing?" "No, I'm trying to summon Lavos so I can destroy him. He's my nemesis. He ruined my life." Then they get sent back in time again. Shenanigans happen. They end up in a magical kingdom in 12,000 BC, so 12,000 years prior, 13,000 years prior to the present, where they find out that Magus was once, you know, like a magical prince. His mom, under the influence of some bad dudes, creates a big palace called the Ocean Palace, which she wants to use to suck Lavos's energy up to create this kind of utopian, you know, quote unquote utopian society that ends up sort of fueling Magus and, you know, letting him slumber and build up his power until he can emerge. Lavos is essentially a parasite that feeds on the DNA of different planets. And once it's been sucked dry of all its DNA and data, Lavos then sort of like goes on to the next planet. And so you go on adventures to get stronger to stop him from doing that.
And the one big plot twist, other than Magus actually being a good guy, though flawed, but a good guy, is Chrono sacrifices himself at one point to, I think it's actually in the king after the Kingdom of Zeal, because like the queen is trying to summon, like, drain Lavos' power, harness it. You mentioned climate change. That is a very clear metaphor for climate change, right there. But we, you know, that's a story for that's a deep dive for another day. But Chrono sacrifices himself, and one of the boldest choices that this game makes is that besides killing your main character, which is crazy, like, you know, you saw it in like
straight up killing him, like he's gone, he's out of the party, like he's toast. Yeah,
you can complete the game without him. You don't have to get him back. Like other games have done things where they killed off characters, like, you know, Final Fantasy VII famously, spoiler alert for those who have not played Final Fantasy VII, you know, 20+-year-old game, but in any case, you know, Aerith dies, but she's not like your main character. She is not the protagonist. Cloud is the main character of 7. It's more crazy when you think about them killing Chrono, which makes sense, which works, I think, even better that he's a silent protagonist, that he does this, because it's the players sacrificing themselves for the greater good, which ties into what Marl is doing, of sacrificing her life and her privilege for the greater good to try to stop this great evil. Chrono just sacrifices himself, and you don't get him. Like, you can complete the game without him. But then this is where the side quests kick in. You can do the side quest in order to get Chrono back, which is goofy and bonkers. And you can kind of tell, apparently, I think Masato Kato, who was one of the main writers of this game, he did not want Chrono to come back, and I believe Yuji Horii did not as well. It was either Horii or Sakaguchi, but two of the big people on this game did not want Chrono to come back. So you can kind of tell that was the case, because the way they bring him back is that if you can go to the Millennium Fair, go to this dude's tent, Bickler is whatever, he's like a magician or something like that, get a Chrono doll, like a Chrono clone doll, and then you travel back to the moment where Chrono was killed in the battle against Lavos, and then you swap out the clone for Chrono, and you save Chrono, and the clone takes his place in some weird time paradox where you use this thing called a time egg, which is called the Chrono Trigger, which allows you to do it's the MacGuffin. It's basically a MacGuffin that brings Chrono back, and that's fine. Like, I have no issue with that. He's useful for the final product, for the final game. And I do think the tone of the game, it doesn't hurt the overall story, because the tone's already kind of lighthearted. So bringing him back, Dragon Ball Z style, shout out, once again, Akira Toriyama, is not the worst thing. But what really shines to me are the other characters' side stories. And what's interesting about this game is that other RPGs, when you do side quests, it almost always is not necessarily personal, they're kind of random almost. Each side quest in this game is very personal to each individual character. Not every side character gets a big side quest. Like Ayla doesn't really have like a big one or anything like that, but Marl's big one is pretty much with Chrono and kind of reconciling with her dad. Luca's is tragic and heartbreaking. Frog's is also really emotional. Robo's is just charming and wonderful, but also like bittersweet almost, even though it has a happy ending. I think because we're running low on time, like, oh my God, we could talk so much about all this side. Like, y'all, you need to...
I think what's interesting, and you kind of touched on this, but like each of the side quests is so catered towards each of the individual characters. And the ones that really stand out to me, like you have Marl's, which is interesting because it circles back on the court scene from the early game, and Marl's dad gets put on trial. Like, first of all, like, bravo to Chrono Trigger for holding like leaders and like a king,
accountable,
no less, liable and accountable in the court of law, like with the justice system. Like, right on Chrono Trigger. He was falsely accused. He shouldn't have been, tried. But it circles back on that and shows Marl's growth as she's gone from sort of plucky, rebellious teen to somebody who comes in and is like, no way, Dad. Like, I got this. I got you. And then you have Robo's, which is cool because it's built around this idea that only Robo could do it, right? So he goes back to 600 AD, helps revitalize, like there's this arid desert in the middle of the continent on 600 AD and in 1000 AD, but he helps through this side quest to do to rebuild and re-terraform the desert back into the forest it used to be before it was deforested. And so only he can do it because he can till a field and tend to this forest for 400 years. And so then you go back to the future, and sure enough, the world map has changed and there's a forest now there, and you recover him in this shrine built to Fiona, who was the steward of the forest, and Robo's there, and you recover him. But then, you go back to 400 AD with Robo in your party, but then there's Robo on the world map, like tilling the field. And that's a lot of fun. And then it also leads to the famous campfire scene, which you mentioned earlier, which has Luca's part of her side story where she's given the opportunity. She goes back in time and she revisits a scene, the time when her mother was hurt in an accident involving one of her dad's inventions, and Luca can intervene and stop the machine from disabling her mom. And you only have one chance. You have to input a password on the controller. You press LARA, which is Luca's mom's name, and if you don't get it on the one try, history sort of like maintains itself, and you go back to the future, and her mom is still is still disabled. If you put in the password correctly, though, you kind of avert the accident, and then you go into the future, and she's able-bodied again. And that one's one that I used to think was really interesting, and now I think it's also one that's worth critical thought, because I don't know that the idea that if I could travel back in time and just do this one thing different, the world would be okay. Yeah, I don't know that that's healthy necessarily. I've been playing Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and thinking about that sort of thing a lot. The idea that, like, if somebody could just give me that opportunity to just go back in time, everything would be okay. Because it's, healing isn't about forward progress and coming to terms with the past. Well, so, there's just this layer of like emotional depth to these stories that exists because they're built around who the characters are, rather than just like, like a funny story or like, some random conflict that the storytellers came up with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I would almost argue with Lucas, it doesn't make it, the world isn't better afterwards. It's better for her, but yes. Lavos is still coming. Like, it doesn't really affect anything. So it's interesting where it's like, it's a selfish act on her part, but at the same time, it makes you wonder, what would you do in that situation? And actually, that was a very specific point that Kato wanted. I watched a chunk of an interview he did with MinMax, where he was talking about a game he had worked on at the time. It was like 4 or 5 years ago. I forget the name of the game. I will look that up while we're chatting. But I think it was Another Eden. He worked on a game called Another Eden, and it was an interview about that, but they were talking about how some of his elements of storytelling is that, specifically in Chrono Trigger, or in his storytelling in general, I mean, he wants players to reflect on themselves. And that's an example of like, what would you do in that situation? You're reflecting on yourself. One last thing I want to touch on with the story, and then we can do just some quick listener comments, and then some quick write-ins, and then final thoughts in the wrap-up. The idea of the entity in the game, which is this kind of nebulous thing that is hinted at, and Ben Hansen of MinMax really he really dove in with Kato on that, which I thought was kind of cool, because there's times where this thing called the entity, they reference it a few times throughout the game, where it's like it's guiding you. They at first think it's Lavos, but then they kind of realize it's not really Lavos. So like, what is guiding these people to like what made them go to 600 AD in the first place? Why was it that specific time, and why was it so perfect? So I like that they kind of allude to this supernatural element to the time travel, of like, it was too perfect, but why was it too perfect? And the entity is kind of their way of describing that away, but without doing it in a shitty way. Like, a lot of times it'd be too easy to be like, here's the MacGuffin, that's why it was so perfect. But they actually write the MacGuffin into the story and into the themes. And like, one of the things that Hansen asked directly, like, where did the idea of the entity come from? And he wrote it in as a higher power. And what I like about that is that he doesn't say God. It's not like this Anglo-Christian God or anything like that. You could interpret it that way if you want to, but he specifically cited a higher power, like nature or time, like something that humans cannot control and cannot technically like wrap their mind around. Like, nature feels like it's this entity it's its own thing, but at the same time, like, you can't quantify nature per se. Like, it's this thing that kind of exists outside of our ability to fully understand everything. Same thing with time. Like, that's something that we can't fully understand, at least right now, I should say. So I thought that was interesting. I just thought that was a really cool idea that he threw in there, but on a light note. It wasn't like beating you over the head with it. It just kind of like, it was a really nice little touch to explain some of the more specific things that happened in the story without explaining everything, leaving it to the player's imaginations to come up with something, which I really liked.
I've always and for me, I've always thought of that as a reference to the player, the player agency in the game, that you holding the controller are the entity that they're referring to, which I always just thought
I think you can still think of it that way too. I mean, you can still think of it that way too. It doesn't have to be like, just because that's what Kato kind of like was hoping for, but he also wants the players to like think, like reflect on themselves, and that's kind of you could still use that same interpretation.
And the sequel also kind of touches more. I'm just kind of thinking about this now, but like Kato's work in Chrono Cross also touches on the idea of fate, or like, some sort of entity that kind of crafts or pushes actions or pushes the world state towards a particular ending, is something that Chrono Cross deals with and explores like at length also, which I think is always interesting. Like Chrono Trigger is a fairly straightforward game, but it has this one complex idea, which is the entity. And Chrono Cross really dives like way off into the deep end on that.
I have yet to play Chrono Cross in earnest, so
oh boy,
if I ever do play it, if you're interested, I'd love to have you back on for another Chrono themed episode.
Yes.
So I only have 2 write-ins for the little section here, for the listener write-in section, and that's mainly my own fault. I didn't post until yesterday on Discord, like, hey, I'm doing this. So I only have 2 write-ins for this. First one up here is Masked Keaton. Masked Keaton writes, when I was in high school, I was an RPG kid, and I really wanted Chrono Trigger. Mom thought I should get a class ring because that's what normal kids got. My class ring sits in a drawer somewhere. I wish I had Chrono Trigger.
Yeah,
you poor man.
Mom was wrong.
Poor
on
soul.
that one. Yeah.
The other write-in is Chris Copeland of the Retro Hangover podcast. Shout out to Retro Hangover. He writes in, Chrono Trigger is the best Super Nintendo RPG, period. The pacing, the characters, the art, the battle system, top notch. Very few things say they're done by a dream team and achieve expectations to that level. Chrono Trigger is that. Yeah, I can't add to that. That's what it is. That almost basically is my final thoughts.
Yeah, it's just like, legendary creators working at the top of their game with sort of unfettered, experience and understanding of the systems they were working on. It's just like, it's impossible to replicate.
It really is. And that really is our final. I really think that like what Chris wrote encapsulates our I mean, at least mine. I can't say for you specifically, but I'd assume you'd agree with me and him. Like that's what this game is. It is something that we'll probably never see the likes of again. It's one of the best RPGs of all time. I don't necessarily say it is the best, but I struggle to think of one that really has this level of polish, pacing, art, music. Like it just hits on every single front, and that is damn near impossible to do. That's my final thoughts. It is a game that is damn near impossible to do, but it's clearly not truly impossible because we have it, and it's a fantastic game.
Absolutely, yeah. 1 out of 1,000 universes, I think, get something like Chrono Trigger, and we just got lucky on that one.
Exactly. Well, Aidan, I think that will wrap up our episode on Chrono Trigger. This was awesome, man. I kept you longer than I promised, and I'm a bad host. I did not respect your time enough for this, but dude, seriously, thank you so much. This was a wonderful conversation. I love this. I can't wait for everyone to hear it. So for my listeners, where can the good people find you online? And of course, what would you like to promote?
Yeah, so I'm online. I'm on Blue Sky at aidanmoher.com. I am not on Twitter anymore or any of the other like socially places, but I am quite active on Blue Sky, so come find me there. I also have a newsletter called Astrolabe, and it's about it's about books, video games, and video game books. And it puts out regular issues. They're free. You can sign up. I talk about a lot of retro video games. I talk a lot about, storytelling in video games and Japanese RPGs. I just wrote a big feature about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and the way that it handles one of the original game's big twists. And so that's up there that people can read right now. And I also have a book that I mentioned earlier. It's called Fight Magic Items, The Rise of... forgot the title of my book. It's called Fight Magic Items, The History of Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and the Rise of Japanese RPGs in the West. It's available anywhere books are sold. You can get it online if you want to. Go into your bookstore, your local bookstore, and ask them if they have it. If they don't, they can order it in for you. It's, it covers the history of console RPGs from the very beginnings when Hironobu Sakaguchi and Yuji Horii were obsessed with Ultima and wizardry. and wanted to make their own games on the NES all the way up through, modern RPGs. And it was a lot of fun to write, and it's been getting great feedback. People have been enjoying it. And I think if you enjoyed this conversation today, you know exactly what to get with the book.
I highly recommend that book, listeners. I had Aidan on last year to discuss it, and I know a bunch of my listeners, actually a few of my listeners I know for a fact bought it. So I very much enjoyed my time reading it. And I for some of the Dragon Quest episodes, I did use it for some research. It was very handy. So definitely go check out that book. For myself, you can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Blue Sky, Threads, Twitch, @StillLoadingPod on all of them, @StillLoadingPodcast on YouTube. Of course, if you would like to support the show, if you like conversations like these and you want to hear more of them and support the show, please consider giving it a 5-star rating or review on whichever podcasting app you use. It helps the algorithm push the algorithm god shenanigans. I don't know, but it does help, and it means a lot to me. So if you wouldn't mind, I would be very appreciative of that. Hopefully you enjoyed the episode. Hopefully it's all 5-star reviews, but please consider doing that. If you want to support the show monetarily, well, I got a bunch of goodies for that as well over at patreon.com/stillloadingpod. For $1 a month, you get all the episodes earlier with better audio quality, as well as access to patron voting rights, which helps guide the direction of the show. Shortly after this episode, I don't know how many weeks or months, but it's coming close, there's going to be an episode on Astral Chain, which is a patron poll episode. That was something that my patrons voted on, so you can help guide the direction and pick games like that. There's a $3 level, which you get everything at the $1 level, plus patron shoutouts, which you heard at the beginning of this episode. $4 level has everything in the previous tiers, plus 2 mini bonus episodes, and the $5 level has everything from before, plus access to my movie podcast, my monthly movie podcast, which currently is called Still Bonding, which is me and a bunch of friends bonding over 007, but there's also going to be Fast and Furious coming soon called Still Family. That's going to be the new name for that, so make sure you check that out, patreon.com/stillloadingpod. And that's it. That's all the time I have for you. This wraps up Toriyama Month, and rest in peace, Akira Toriyama. I hope these last 4 episodes do a small semblance of justice to the legacy you left behind. So this is just my way of talking about it. I finally got to experience Dragon Quest. I finally got to talk about Chrono Trigger. I wish it was under better circumstances, but rest in peace, Akira Toriyama. Thank you for everything. And with all that said, listeners, Aidan, thank you for joining me once again.
Thanks so much. I'm going to hop in the Epic and go back in time and have some dinner with my family.
Future Josh jumping in here for one final little snippet. I realized I was so engrossed recording this episode. I really enjoyed my conversation with Aidan that my little tribute here at the end, my little farewell to Toriyama, felt a little underwhelming, at least in my opinion. So I wanted to end this episode with something that I wrote on Twitter, and I actually read this to my patrons when, shortly after Toriyama passed away. It was one of the bonus episodes, and I reflected more on his passing in that episode. You can hear that if you're interested at the $4 level over on Patreon. But I wanted to read what I wrote on Twitter here. It was like an 11 tweet thread that kind of just me thinking over what Toriyama meant to me. And this is how I'm going to cap off Toriyama Month and how I'll finish this Chrono Trigger episode here. So here it is. Here's what I wrote. I've been reflecting more on Akira Toriyama's passing and why it's hit me harder than I expected. Celebrity deaths don't always get me in the feels, and very few do, but this one hurts. Growing up, I was made fun of for liking Dragon Ball Z. The whole anime is weird and therefore bad trope that was used to mock geeks, etc. Thankfully, it didn't stop me from liking it. But it did stop me from talking about it since I didn't want to be made fun of. I was also pretty religious growing up, so was my family, and we were pretty active in our church. Besides the usual church functions, we would also go on missions trips to different places to help with the building projects or hand out food or clothes or things of that nature. Once I was old enough, I was probably around 13 or 14, I started going on missions trips to Mexico. We would go to a small orphanage and help them with projects that needed to get done. Roofing, putting in fences, plumbing work, all that kind of stuff. After work was done for the day, we would spend the rest of the afternoon/evening playing with the kids. And most of the time we would end up playing soccer with them, but a few times we had some arts and crafts stuff planned. During one of those arts and crafts sessions, I decided to start drawing Goku from Dragon Ball Z. At that time in my life, I was pretty obsessed with it. I would trace over pictures of Dragon Ball Z characters until I could draw it from memory. If you asked me to draw them in a different pose, I couldn't do it. I was stuck doing that one pose for whichever character I was drawing. But that didn't matter, because once I had finished drawing it, a few kids came over to take a look. They started saying Goku excitedly, and then they mimicked the Kamehameha blast. And I honestly was in shock. I grew up in a small sheltered town, and I didn't have much of a concept of the world outside of my little bubble. Finding out that kids in a different country not only knew Dragon Ball Z, but also liked it was amazing to me. And I had thought for so long that not a lot of people liked anime, / it wasn't cool to like it. I had assumed the kids I met here would be the same, and I'm happy I was wrong. This to me is what Toriyama did for the world. He made art so universally loved that it crossed culture and language barriers. It helped me connect with kids that I couldn't even speak the same language as and gave us a connection. As a sheltered, shy geek who grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, Toriyama opened up the world to me and helped me connect with others that I wouldn't have been able to otherwise. I can't thank him enough for that. Rest in peace, Akira Toriyama. And that's it. That's all I got for Toriyama Month, y'all. Thank you all so much for joining me. Thank you all for listening. And with all that said, listeners, I will see you all next time.